Welcome back to the Sci-Fireplace. This is the first 5 books in my 100-book challenge. Number 1 is Galactic Patrol by E. Doc Smith, a very historically important space opera. It's the first in the Lensman series. I think there are 2 books that technically precede it, but this is the first true Lensman book. And essentially, it is Judge Dredd in space. It's a pulpy, golden age adventure story, kind of boys narrative. And it sucks. I didn't like it at all. I gave it a 3 out of 10 as a spoiler, I guess. I'm back to the rating system because I'm doing 100 books. I'm keeping a little diary, and we're just doing this chronologically. So 3 out of 10. There were enough points to get it to 3. There was some cool stuff in it. There was like a water world that was a cool setting. There's a villain that is slightly interesting, and he has this episode where he travels to an alien planet and has kind of a moral crisis, and that was cool. Basically everything that is tangential to the plot and the protagonist and all of the hard SF in it and the description and the prose, everything else is good. Good enough to hold my attention for little jaunts of the book, but for the most part, really disliked it a lot. I thought the prose was clunky and bad, and just because it was published in the 30s doesn't give it a pass to have bad prose. And I understand the era in which we are treading here. The golden era is famous for this kind of prose and pulp fiction. Doesn't mean that I have to enjoy it or like it. I can appreciate its historical significance. It is a chore to read. It's like going to the dentist for me. I did get a sense of enjoyment out of it because it is very clearly the source material for The Iron Dream by Norman Spinrad, which is a book satirizing this era of genre fiction and its values and its moral outlook, which is another thing that I found really distasteful. The protagonist is basically Superman, kills with impunity, is given total license to do whatever he wants, and the story is following his progression from being a recruit in this galactic police force who are fighting a rival empire of thieves, space thieves, pirates, and ne'er-do-wells, just going around killing as many of them as possible, which I get it, fine. I don't care about that, but it's the kind of perspective, the sense of relish with which he does it, and the open contempt for the idea of due process and democratic controls over the police or any kind of check or control over the use of violent force. It gets bogged down in these trenches of hard SF description of the physics of how things work in this universe, and I just found it very boring, uninteresting. Again, I don't dislike it because it is old. It's not because it's old, it's because it's bad. Next is Weeping May Tarry by Raymond F. Jones and Lester Del Rey. I bought it because of the cover. I thought it looked great. I think I had just read Case of Conscience by James Blish, which has a lot to do with religious themes. So does this one. Much less subtly than Blish. It is not really worthy of inclusion in the same breath as Blish, other than to point to kind of thematic symmetries. And I bought it because the cover looked cool. It's about a far future where this race of lizard alien men live on this planet that was devastated by a near extinction level event where a missile hit the planet that was sent from an unknown distant war and devastated the population. And now for 2,000 years, they've lived under the yoke of this extremely strict and oppressive religious system that looks kind of superficially like Buddhism. And the story follows a space mission that is lorded over by a priest of this religion who has total authority over all of the crew, who are secretly atheists, and is an Orthodox true believer who enforces his strict religious vision on the crew, and this precipitates a lot of tensions that erupt into all kinds of problems. And I can't really say that much about what happens in the rest of the book without giving it away, other than to say it's the dumbest ending I think I've ever read. Just so on the nose. It's a very, I must spoil this, and if you don't want to hear the spoilers, if for some reason you want to read this book, which I gave a 4 out of 10 because I also didn't really like this one so much, then I guess skip ahead to the next one. The ending, pseudo spoiler, is the most like on the nose religious. I don't even want to call it allegory. It's like finger painting. It's like narrative finger painting. It's like a Bible story from a kid's book. And the basic message of the book is that Jesus is real. And I don't hate it for that reason. I was just watching, in fact, an interview with Orson Scott Card talking about religion and portrayal of religion in science fiction. And I'm completely sympathetic to it. I find it really interesting. I like reading those kinds of books. James Blish being a good example. Or pro-religious books, pro-Christian books. I'm not afraid of it. I'm not offended by it. I don't think that it's dangerous or evil or inherently stupid. But this book is it is stupid. Maybe not the other adjectives, but it is dumb. The first half of the book is fairly good. I wonder actually if they each wrote a half and then kind of spliced it together, because it does feel like 2 novellas that were stitched up into one book. Maybe that actually literally is the case. I didn't do any digging on the history of the book. It definitely feels that way. And the first half of the book is decently plotted. The characters are okay, and it builds some tension to a point where it was interesting. I was interested to see how the tension was resolved, and it turns out the tension is resolved just by hand waving it away. Just there was a point in the book where it kind of offhandedly explained why the discord was occurring, all the mysterious events in the book occurred. It's just kind of like, oh, it was this, and it doesn't matter, and we're on to the B plot for the whole second half of the book. The characters, I will say, are okay, are fairly memorable. Not all that great. There is a scene of them exiling someone to die on an alien planet that was pretty good. It was effective. Other than that, I think this one is pretty skippable. This next one I loved. This is Journey to the Center of the Earth by Jules Verne, and this is the first Jules Verne book that I've ever read. And I, not having read any others, I have to think that this was a good fortuitous place to start with Verne. I loved it. I thought it was wonderful. And another example of just because it is old does not mean that it is bad. Also does not mean that it is necessarily good. But this has aged beautifully well. And going into it, I thought it would be. I saw the kind of King Kong stop motion animation in my head, and I thought it would be sort of campy. I thought it would be campy, and it wasn't at all. It's a beautifully written, slow, gentle, character-driven story that felt like very, I want to say pastoral. That doesn't actually apply necessarily, but it has that feeling of just kind of in the diary, actually, I described it as like going on one of those really old rides at Disneyland where you're just kind of floating down a river and there's kind of a animatronic dinosaur on the side next to your boat. It feels like that. It feels quaint. And I don't mean that in a pejorative or diminutive sense. Quaint in a really great way. And I was surprised by how much of the book, is actually a journey, is just them trying to get to the main action of the book. At least half of it is just a travelogue of them going to Iceland and meeting Icelanders and trying to find the entrance to the tunnel to the center of the Earth. And also how much of it just centered around the relationships between the 3 principal cast members. There's a German professor and scientist, geologist, his nephew, who is on the journey to the center of the Earth somewhat very begrudgingly, and then the Icelandic stoic guide that accompanies them on their adventure. And they are big, broadly drawn characters, at least the uncle and the guide are, but all believable. And their relationships develop gratifyingly over the course of the book. And it's just a wonderful read. It builds some really great tension and peril as it goes along. There were sections of it that were page turners, and the actual spectacle of meeting all the prehistoric animals and everything that you anticipate happening in the book is a relatively short part of the book. The prose is wonderful. I mean, this is the what translation is this? This is the Frank Wynne translation. Obviously I've not read another one. I thought the prose was just wonderful. It's just so easy to read. It's just fluid. It's like drinking a big cup of lukewarm herbal tea, which sounds a little bit dreadful now that I say that, but it's just great. There's one section especially where the nephew is having this hallucination. He hallucinates that he's regressing through every stage of the evolution of life on the planet and the development of the planet itself until he's floating in this diffuse cloud of cosmic vapors and debris that would eventually form into the Earth. And it's just this like vivid, like weird, standout 2-page section of almost psychedelic reverie. It's just so beautifully written. It has moments of that where it just reaches across the centuries and grabs you. It is slightly slow. There's a lot of discussion of the science undergirding a lot of the things that happen in the book. There's a lot of discussion of geology and biology and such, and that can kind of weigh down the narrative a little bit. I thought it was great. I gave it an 8 out of 10. I was really pleased by this. And these are all randomly picked with the phone app. The next pick was Across Realtime by Vernor Vinge. And this is an omnibus of 2 novels, The Peace War and Marooned in Realtime. I read these. First of all, this book kicks ass, just, aesthetically. This is a first edition, first printing, hardcover. I don't remember where I got it, probably a thrift store somewhere. And there's Vinge, who might bear a little bit of resemblance to somebody. So for context, Vernor Vinge wrote one of my all-time favorite science fiction books, or books really ever, generally, Fire Upon the Deep, and also its prequel, Deepness in the Sky, 2 of my favorite SF books ever. Fire Upon the Deep especially, I think it's an absolute masterpiece. And this was the series that he wrote before the Zones of Thought series, which is the books that I just described. This is like a cyberpunk kind of, it reminds me of Fallout, the games. I never really played them that much, but I think it's a very similar setting. It's a pseudo post-apocalyptic future in which a government contractor developed this technology called bobbling that creates these spheres that trap everything and everyone inside of them in time. This contractor that developed the bobbling technology was suddenly thrust into a position of total power and dominance over every other countervailing power structure in the world, every world government, and enforces a peace, a violent peace, in the midst of this enormous world war that devastated the population. And also maybe this peace authority, which is the kind of pseudo-government that it evolves into, may have released diseases that wiped out the majority of the population of the planet. So there's only, it seems like there's only like 1 million human beings left alive on the planet when this book takes place. And the Peace Authority exists in this kind of permanent stasis where they are no longer technologically innovating, and they are being lapped by this caste called the Tinkers, who are inventors, citizen scientists who are working in private illegal labs to generate new forms of tech that maybe can pose an existential threat to the Peace Authority. And it follows an elderly scientist and his protege, who is a young boy who comes from the slums, who's a wunderkind genius, math and science genius, attempting to instigate the overthrow of the Peace Authority. It suffers a little bit, I hate to say it, it suffers from Vinge's writing style. And when I branched off of the Zones of Thought books after reading Fire Upon the Deep and Deepness in the Sky, I was a little bit startled to find that I did not enjoy reading Vernor Vinge all that much. I read Rainbow's End afterwards, which he wrote in 2006, and I thought it was a total clunker. I really didn't like it at all. And this book, both books, flirt with that level of kind of, it was hard to connect with it. He has this tendency of, well, he's very, very much a hard SF writer. He's one of the hardest of the hard SF writers. He was a mathematics professor, actually here in San Diego at SDSU for many years, and is probably most famous for his fiction, but he's also famous for being the guy who came up with the idea of the singularity being this event where AI becomes self-aware and the consequences of which are not predictable to us, and it'll completely change our destiny as a species and potentially have, dire consequences for us. So as a practicing famous scientist and theorist, his work is laden with really hard exposition and hard SF, and his writing also suffers a bit just from this quality that's kind of hard to put into words. It's just clunky. It's plotting. He spends tons of time with his characters, having them speculate about the plot and speculate about one another's motivations and what's going to happen at cost of anything actually happening all that often in the book. So it's kind of this high-level mental machination that you're privy to that's laid out, illustrated, every painstaking detail of the character's thought processes. And it should be a thriller. It, I think, was meant to be a techno thriller, but it does not quite manage to thrill. Kind of have to wade through this swamp of commentary internal in the book to get to the action moments. And the action is written in that same kind of clunky style where it's just these declarative statements. Then this happens, then this happens, then this, and then this. The characters are fairly flat. Not all that great. They're just good enough. That's Vernor Vinge's thing. His characters are usually just good enough, unless they're an alien, and then they're amazing. I think that's one of the reasons why Fire Upon the Deep is such a standout, and it is like a quantum leap better in quality than these books. And that's not a huge criticism because it's significantly better than the majority of science fiction books that have ever been written. But this was a slow, somewhat painstaking read that I did like a lot. I gave it a 7 out of 10. I did like it. It feels a little bit unwieldy. And then this Marooned in Realtime, I can't say that much about this from the jump without spoiling what happens in this book. It is actually a little bit more of a thriller than the first one is. There were passages of it that I thought were more compelling, that actually did grip me and hold my attention. There were parts of it that were like really page-turny, but this is all kind of counterweighted by this detective story, this whodunit plot at the center of it that dominates most of the book, that I just did not find interesting at all. I don't really like murder mysteries. I don't read mysteries. And this wasn't that interesting even to me as someone who's just watched like thriller movies and police dramas. And it's just a detective story that doesn't really need to drive the plot, because the world building in this book is great. This had flavors of Hot House by Brian Aldiss. It takes place in the way, way far distant future, and all kinds of like weird animals exist throughout the book, and there's like great, cool, compelling world building. There's cool tech. The tech in the story is handled like really well. There are just so many cool little details in it, but the plot itself, the characters are just a drag to me, which was too bad. And it was a little bit of a chore to finish it. And I think that's actually a pretty good summary of the book. It's a detective novel that takes place in the far future, and all the stuff that is tangential to that is really cool and great, and I wish that he spent more time here on the edges than here in this plodding detective story where, again, you just get to walk through every little increment in the especially protagonist's thought processes and speculation about what might be going on and who in fact done it. Would have been a better book if there was less of that. I gave this one a 6 out of 10. I do ultimately prefer this one. Let's do the next pick. Number 6 on this 100-book challenge is going to be Eon and Eternity by Greg Bear. Hell yeah. Here it is, the omnibus. This is 2 novels, Eon and Eternity. I think this is a book club edition. If I like Eon, I will read Eternity. Or what are the rules? Do I have to read both of them because I picked this one? I think maybe I do, because I did the across real-time thing. Okay, I will at least read Eon, and then I will see you on the next one. Let's see if I can keep up this pace.